The studio lights gleamed as Jasmine Crockett walked onto the stage of The Late Show. Her crimson blazer, a deliberate choice against the backdrop of carefully orchestrated comedy. Stephen Colbert rose from behind his desk, his trademark grin wide and welcoming. Arms extended in theatrical greeting. The audience erupted in applause. But Crockett noticed something in his eyes that made her straighten her shoulders slightly. She had been invited to discuss the demolition of the White House East Wing, a topic she considered gravely serious. What she did not yet know was that Colbert had prepared an entirely different kind of segment. Congresswoman Crockett. "Welcome. Welcome," Colbert began, his voice carrying that familiar blend of warmth and mischief that had made him beloved by millions. "I have to say, when I heard you were coming on to talk about Trump literally tearing down the White House, I thought, finally, someone who understands that sometimes you just need to laugh at the absurdity of it all." Crockett settled into the guest chair, her posture poised but cautious. "Thank you for having me, Stephen. Though I should clarify that while the situation certainly has absurd elements, the implications are quite serious." Colbert waved his hand dismissively, his grin never faltering. "Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. But come on. You have to admit, the man promised not to touch the existing building. And then what does he do? Brings in a backhoe like he's playing SimCity with American history. It's perfect comedy. It would be comedy if it weren't also a violation of comedy." Crockett started. But Colbert was already moving forward, his rhythm trained by years of television pacing that waited for no one. "I mean, what's next? Right, is he going to turn the Lincoln bedroom into a Trump Tower timeshare? Put golden toilets in the Oval Office? Oh wait, he probably already tried that." The audience laughed, and Colbert beamed, feeding off their energy. Seriously though, the image of that backhoe ripping into the East Wing. It's like watching someone take a sledgehammer to their rental apartment. We are definitely not getting that security deposit back. Crockett attempted to interject again, her voice firm but measured. "Stephen, the issue goes beyond the visual absurdity. The East Wing has historical significance Historical significance. Yes. Absolutely," Colbert interrupted, leaning forward with exaggerated seriousness that somehow still managed to feel dismissive. "But you have to admit, in an administration that has normalized so much chaos, watching Trump literally demolish the White House feels almost on brand. It's the perfect metaphor. He's been demolishing democratic norms for months. Why not demolish the actual building too?" A murmur of laughter rippled through the studio. Crockett's expression remained composed, but something shifted in her eyes. Years of courtroom experience had taught her to recognize when someone was performing rather than listening. And right now, Colbert was firmly in performance mode. "The metaphor is apt," she said carefully. "But the reality is that we're living in a sitcom written by someone who got fired from The Apprentice for being too ridiculous." Colbert continued, his momentum unstoppable. "I mean, Treasury Department employees aren't allowed to take photos of the construction. Not generally something you do when you're proud of your work. It's like telling wedding guests not to take pictures because you're marrying a body pillow of Mariah Carey." The audience roared. Colbert was on a roll, his comedic instincts honed by thousands of hours of performance. But Crockett sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, waiting. The camera operator, sensing something interesting, kept one lens trained on her face, capturing the subtle tightening around her eyes. "Stephen," she said when the laughter died down, her voice cutting through with unexpected clarity. "May I respond to the actual issue?" Of course," Colbert said. gesturing magnanimously. Please. Tell us why we should be outraged instead of just laughing at the dumb. I'm not asking anyone to choose between outrage and laughter. Crockett interrupted, her tone sharpening just enough to make Colbert pause mid-gesture. I'm suggesting that treating everything as comedy might be part of the problem. The shift in energy was immediate. Colbert's smile remained, but it became slightly fixed. The audience, trained to follow his lead, grew uncertain. This was not the direction the segment was meant to go. Part of the problem, Colbert echoed, his tone still light but with a new edge of defensiveness. I think comedy is how we process the insanity. It's how we cope. It's how we keep from despairing. Is it, Crockett asked, simply? Or is it how we avoid actually doing anything about it? The question hung in the air like smoke. Colbert opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. I don't think making people laugh about political absurdity is the same as telling them to do nothing. Perhaps not intentionally, Crockett said, her voice remaining even, almost gentle, which somehow made her words land harder. But when everything becomes a punchline, when every violation of norms gets the same treatment as a celebrity scandal, we create a kind of emotional numbness. People laugh. They feel like they've processed their anger. And then they move on. Nothing changes. Colbert shifted in his chair, his famous quick wit suddenly finding no easy retort. So you're saying comedy is bad, that we shouldn't? I'm saying that when you interrupted me 3 times in the first 2 minutes to make jokes about body pillows and security deposits, you demonstrated exactly what I'm talking about, Crockett said, and now there was steel beneath the velvet of her voice. You turned a serious conversation about the demolition of a historically significant building into entertainment before I could even explain why it matters. The studio had gone quiet in a way that rarely happened during Colbert's show. This was not the comfortable silence of anticipation before a punchline. This was the uncomfortable silence of recognition. Colbert started. But Crockett raised one hand slightly. A gesture so subtle yet so commanding that he actually stopped. Let me tell you what you didn't let me say. Stephen, the East Wing of the White House isn't just a building. It houses the offices of the First Lady and her staff. It's where Eleanor Roosevelt held press conferences for female journalists at a time when women weren't allowed in the West Wing press room. It's where Jacqueline Kennedy worked to preserve White House history. It's where Michelle Obama launched initiatives that fed hungry children and educated girls around the world. Crockett's voice grew stronger with each sentence. Not louder, but more resonant, filling the space with a gravity that comedy could not diminish. When Trump ordered that demolition without proper historical review, without consultation with preservation experts, without even informing Congress, he didn't just violate protocol. He demonstrated that American history, particularly the history made by women, is disposable to him, expendable, worth less than his vanity project ballroom where he can serve, and I quote, drinks and cocktails to his wealthy donors. Colbert's face had transformed from amused host to something more complicated. The cameras, which usually cut away during serious moments to find audience reactions, stayed locked on the two of them. The reason I came on your show tonight, Stephen, was because I believed that your audience, your significant platform, could help people understand the stakes, not laugh them away. Understand them. Crockett leaned forward slightly, her gaze direct but not hostile. But you didn't even let me get to the substance before turning it into a bit. Colbert began, then stopped himself. For perhaps the first time in his tenure as host, he appeared genuinely at a loss. You're right. I did that. The admission caught everyone off guard. Colbert ran a hand through his hair. a gesture of real vulnerability rather than performed humility. I did exactly what you said. I made you the straight man to my comedy without even considering that maybe the comedy was getting in the way of something more important. Crockett watched him carefully, her expression softening slightly but remaining serious. I understand the impulse. When reality becomes overwhelming, humor feels like survival. But I've watched your show for years. Stephen, I know you're capable of being both funny and substantive. What concerns me is that lately, the comedy has started to feel like a shield. Not just for you, but for all of us. A shield from what Colbert asked. And the question sounded genuine. From actually confronting what's happening, Crockett said, when Trump tears down part of the White House, it's not just funny or absurd. It's a statement about power and who gets to decide what matters. When he prioritizes white refugees over others, when his nominees admit to having a Nazi streak, when he systematically dismantles institutions. These aren't just punchlines. They're choices with consequences for real people. She paused, letting her words settle before continuing. And when we treat them primarily as entertainment, we participate in normalizing them. We make it easier for people to shrug and say, well, that's just Trump being Trump. And then do nothing. Colbert was silent for a long moment. The audience remained quiet, sensing they were witnessing something unusual. Something unscripted in the truest sense. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its performative quality. I've built my career on finding the absurd in politics, he said slowly, on making people laugh at things that might otherwise make them despair. And I've always told myself that laughter is a form of resistance, that keeping people engaged through comedy is valuable. But you're saying that's not enough. I'm saying it's not always appropriate, Crockett corrected. There's a time for comedy and a time for gravity. The question is whether we can still tell the difference. Colbert nodded slowly. Tell me what I should have let you say. About the East Wing. About all of it. No jokes this time. What followed was unlike any segment The Late Show had aired before. For nearly 15 minutes, Crockett spoke without interruption. She detailed the historical significance of the spaces being demolished. She explained the legal questions surrounding the demolition. She connected it to a broader pattern of disregard for institutional norms and historical preservation. More importantly, she talked about what it meant. How the Treasury Department's order not to photograph the demolition echoed authoritarian attempts to control information. How the prioritization of a ballroom over preserved history reflected values that extended far beyond architecture. How the failure of Congress to effectively check this action revealed the erosion of constitutional balance. Colbert listened without reaching for a joke, without deflecting into humor. His audience, following his lead, listened too. And in that listening, something shifted. When Crockett finished, Colbert took a long breath. I need to say something. And I need to say it without trying to be funny about it. He turned directly to the camera, addressing his viewers rather than his guest. I think I've been doing us all a disservice, myself included. I've been so focused on making this administration's actions entertaining that I've maybe made them seem less serious than they are. He looked back at Crockett. You came here to sound an alarm. And I tried to turn it into a comedy bit. That was wrong. It wasn't entirely wrong, Crockett said. And for the first time, she smiled slightly. Comedy has its place. But perhaps the better question is what happens after the laughter. Do people feel informed enough to act, or do they just feel entertained enough to move on? What should people do, Colbert asked. Concretely, right now. Crockett was ready for this question. Contact your representatives. Demand that Congress exercise its oversight authority. Insist on proper historical review before any further demolition. Support organizations that track and document these changes. Most importantly, stop treating each new violation as just another crazy story. Start treating them as a pattern that demands response. The show went to commercial break shortly after, but the impact was already spreading. Clips of the exchange appeared online within minutes. But these clips were different from the usual Colbert segments. There were no laugh reactions, no comedic stings. Instead, viewers shared the moments of confrontation, the admission, the substantive discussion that followed. Social media erupted with responses that split along unexpected lines. Some praised Colbert for his humility in accepting criticism on air. Others criticized him for needing that criticism in the first place. But the dominant response was something else entirely, a dawning recognition of how comedy had perhaps become complicit in normalization. Major media critics wrote pieces analyzing the exchange. "When did we stop taking things seriously?" asked The Atlantic. "The danger of laughing through the crisis," ran in the New York Times. Think pieces proliferated, examining the role of political satire in an era of actual crisis versus normal political dysfunction. But the most significant impact came from Colbert himself. The next night, he opened his show differently. Instead of launching into jokes about the day's news, he spent the first segment seriously discussing the White House demolition. He brought on architectural historians. He showed documentation of what was being lost. He provided contact information for representatives on relevant committees. "I'm not giving up comedy," he told his audience. "But I'm going to try harder to make sure the comedy serves the truth rather than obscuring it." Because Representative Crockett was right. When everything is a punchline, nothing is serious. And some things need to be taken seriously. The approach resonated. His ratings actually increased as viewers responded to the blend of humor and substance. Other late-night hosts began examining their own approaches, questioning whether they had fallen into the same trap. For Crockett, the exchange became another example of her gift for transforming confrontation into consciousness-raising. She had not attacked Colbert personally or questioned his motives. Instead, she had articulated a problem that many Americans had felt but struggled to name: the exhaustion of treating everything as entertainment. The sense that constant mockery had somehow replaced meaningful resistance. Within weeks, congressional hearings on the White House demolition gained unexpected traction. Representatives who had been content to let the issue slide found themselves facing constituents who demanded answers. The project was put on hold pending proper historical review. While Trump raged on social media about obstruction and fake history, preservation experts conducted the assessments that should have happened initially. The Treasury Department's photo ban was lifted after whistleblowers leaked images anyway, and public outcry made the secrecy untenable. What those images revealed proved Crockett's concerns justified. The demolition had been rushed. Improper techniques had been used, and historically significant features had already been damaged beyond repair. Architectural historians surveyed the destruction with dismay. Preservation organizations filed lawsuits. Congress held formal hearings where Crockett, now armed with documentation of what had been lost, methodically built a case for stronger protections for federal historic sites. Her testimony, detailed and devastating, made clear that this was never just about one building. It was about the precedent being set for how future administrations might treat American heritage. The legislation that emerged, the Federal Historic Preservation Act, bore Crockett's imprint. It required congressional approval for major modifications to historically significant federal buildings. It established independent review processes that could not be circumvented by presidential directive. It created real accountability for those who damaged or destroyed protected spaces. Trump vetoed the bill, calling it another attempt by radical Democrats to obstruct my beautiful projects. But the veto was overridden with bipartisan support. Even Republicans who typically supported Trump recognized that protecting American history should not be a partisan issue. The relationship between Crockett and Colbert evolved as well. He invited her back to the show 3 months later, this time to discuss the passage of the Preservation Act. The conversation was different. Colbert found ways to be both entertaining and serious, to make people laugh while also making them think. Crockett, in turn, showed she could appreciate good humor while maintaining her focus on substance. "I owe you an apology," Colbert said during that second appearance. "Not just for interrupting you, though I definitely apologize for that, but for treating your concerns as comedy material before understanding what you were actually trying to say. And I should acknowledge that I came on your show with certain assumptions about how it would go." Crockett replied, "I expected to be interrupted and dismissed. I came prepared to fight that battle. What I didn't expect was that you'd actually listen when I called it out. You gave me a choice," Colbert said. "I could double down and stay in comedy mode. Or I could recognize that you were offering me something more valuable than a good segment. You were offering me a chance to do better. Most people don't get that chance on live television." The exchange went viral again, but this time for different reasons. It became an example of how public figures could model accountability, growth, and mutual respect. Commentators noted that both Crockett and Colbert had emerged from their initial confrontation with enhanced credibility. For Crockett, the incident reinforced her reputation as someone who could challenge power regardless of where it resided. She had taken on conservative commentators, fellow members of Congress, and now a beloved liberal comedian. In each case, her approach remained consistent: prepare thoroughly, speak truthfully, demand to be heard, and focus on substance over spectacle. Law schools began teaching the Colbert interview alongside the Miller hearing as examples of different types of confrontation. The Miller exchange demonstrated how to dismantle a hostile opponent. The Colbert exchange showed how to redirect an ally who had lost his way. Both required preparation, composure, and the courage to speak uncomfortable truths. Young women entering politics, journalism, and advocacy work studied Crockett's techniques. She had shown that being heard did not require matching volume or aggression. Sometimes it required the opposite: a calm refusal to let interruption derail substance, a willingness to name what was happening rather than pretend it was not, a commitment to elevating the conversation rather than winning the argument. The broader cultural impact extended beyond politics. Corporate boardrooms began examining how humor and casualness in workplace culture might be masking serious issues. Media organizations revised their approaches to covering political crisis. Educational institutions incorporated discussions about the relationship between satire and civic engagement into their curricula. Colbert himself experienced something of a renaissance. Critics who had begun to see his comedy as predictable found new depth in his willingness to balance humor with gravity. His show became known not just for making people laugh at political absurdity, but for helping them understand why it mattered and what they could do about it. 2 years after their initial exchange, Colbert interviewed Crockett again, this time about her decision to run for the Senate. The conversation was warm, substantive, and yes, occasionally funny. They had developed a rapport built on mutual respect and the shared memory of a moment when both had been willing to be uncomfortable in service of something larger. "You changed how I do my job," Colbert told her during that interview. "Not by attacking me, but by trusting me enough to tell me the truth about what I was doing wrong. That's a rare gift. You changed how I think about media and messaging." Crockett responded, "You showed me that meeting people where they are, even when where they are is late-night comedy, can still lead to meaningful conversation. We just have to be willing to push past the comfort zone." The exchange between Stephen Colbert and Jasmine Crockett became a case study in how even well-intentioned people can contribute to problematic patterns, and how accountability does not require enemies. Sometimes it requires allies willing to tell hard truths and others willing to hear them. In the end, perhaps the most significant legacy was the simplest, a demonstration that interruption is not just a matter of words cutting across other words. It is about which voices get heard, which concerns get treated seriously, and who decides what matters. Crockett had been interrupted 3 times in 2 minutes by someone who meant no harm, who actually admired her, who thought he was helping. That made her response all the more important. Because if interruption and dismissal could happen even in spaces designed to be friendly, how much more pervasive must it be in spaces designed to be hostile? And if comedy, that great tool for speaking truth to power, could become a means of avoiding uncomfortable truths, how vigilant must we all be about the ways we process and respond to crisis? The White House East Wing was eventually restored, though some damage could never be undone. Trump's ballroom project was abandoned after the Preservation Act made it legally and politically untenable. The space became instead a museum dedicated to the often overlooked history of women's contributions to American governance. A fitting repurposing that Crockett herself helped design. Years later, visitors to that museum would pass a small plaque near the entrance. It quoted words spoken on a late-night comedy show. Words that had started as confrontation and become catalyst. When everything becomes a punchline, when every violation of norms gets the same treatment as a celebrity scandal, we create a kind of emotional numbness. People laugh. They feel like they've processed their anger, and then they move on. Nothing changes. Below that quote, another, but you're saying that's not enough. And below that, the response that had started everything I'm saying, it's not always appropriate. There's a time for comedy and a time for gravity. The question is whether we can still tell the difference. Together, those words stood as a reminder that democracy requires more than laughter or outrage. It requires attention, discrimination, and the willingness to demand substance even from allies. It requires knowing when to joke and when to listen, when to perform and when to reflect, when to entertain and when to inform. Most of all, it requires people willing to speak uncomfortable truths and others willing to hear them. In that exchange between a comedian seeking laughs and a congresswoman seeking action, both found something more valuable. A path toward conversation that honors both humor and gravity, that recognizes the power of each without letting either become a shield from the work democracy demands. The lesson spread far beyond one show, one exchange, one issue. It became part of how a generation learned to engage with power, crisis, and each other. Not through choosing between comedy and seriousness, but through understanding that both serve truth only when wielded with wisdom about when each is needed. And in the end, perhaps that was the real victory, not that Jasmine Crockett had silenced Stephen Colbert's comedy, but that she had helped him, and through him, millions of viewers. Remember that the best comedy does not help us escape from reality. It helps us see reality more clearly so we can change it.